be tomorrow, but let me congratulate you and your team on the deep thinking, conceptual thinking, and the additions that you've made into the empowerment framework, and I'll touch on two of those. But I think what's really exciting is the conceptual thinking married to the action on the ground, the program, and the fact that the women are here. And that's what's really different about this project compared to other projects. So congratulations, and I look forward to discussions tomorrow. As Bhavani said, I've done a lot of work thinking on empowerment, and then sort of stopped and thought it was time to hand over to the next generation, that I'd done my bit. 5 years ago, as you know, there was a terrible rape in Delhi, the city where I grew up. The press dubbed her Nirbhaya. And that gang rape in a moving bus disturbed me very much, as it did all thinking people, all caring people. And I started out with a puzzle, that why is it that despite great increases in education, in women's education, employment, and incomes, all the things that we thought would empower women, why is violence against women still so widespread? If you look at the World Economic Forum comes up with an index of the gender gap. The top 5 countries are usually the Icelandic countries and Rwanda, and Sweden is always number 1, number 2, or number 3 or 4. But Sweden also had a huge Me Too movement. Sweden has 48% of women in parliament. So everything that we said would result in women's empowerment did do on the external side, but in the same society, women were being abused, were being molested, and the women kept quiet, and the men continued doing what they were doing. And why is that? And I think your framework touches on 2 very important issues that have been ignored across academia as well as in the intervention world of empowerment. And that is that if women do not feel safe, if women are not safe, 1 in 3 women around the world, so this is not an India problem, this is a universal problem, and it's really, really important to remember that. 1 in 3 women across the world are physically abused, are hit and sexually abused, and mostly it's by the intimate partners. So it's all happening, not all, but a lot of it is happening within the family or the extended family. And there has been a silence around this. So the fact that you have safety is, safety and security is really, really important in your index. The second is culture. After the Nirbhaya rape, there was a lot of focus on laws and police, and that was right. And then if you just think of it, just the math of it, if you have 600 million women and children, they'll never be kept safe by the police. It's impossible, right? So everyone says, well, it's the culture. You have to change the culture. So what is it in the culture that needs to change? Because culture itself is a very big word, right? You throw your hands up and you say, well, culture is sacrosanct, you can't really touch people's culture, and so we keep quiet. So I decided to really look into, since I'm an anthropologist, psychologist, I decided to really try and understand what is it in the culture that on the one hand leads to physical or sexual abuse, and on the other hand leads to everyday sexism against women, everyday devaluation of women. If there's something that connects this on this wide continuum. And I honestly didn't know the answers. But I was very curious, and so I set out on an exploration, not knowing that it would become a research project, not knowing that I would end up writing another book, because I had promised myself no more books. So the question I asked, very simply, in this exploration really started at St. Stephen's College, which is the most elite college in India, which is in Delhi. And I still get asked to give talks on poverty and development. And I said I'll come if I can talk about gender issues and explore the issue with the students. And I asked a very simple question, and they wrote down their answers. What does it mean to be a good woman or a good man today? For you. Not some abstraction, but to you. And then we had a discussion and we talked about it. The second question, and all of you should think about this, that I asked, and you have to answer this very quickly just for yourself. What are the 3 words that come to your mind? What are the 3 words that come to your mind when you think of yourself as a good man or a good woman? Very quickly, without trying to think about it, what are the 3 words that jump to your mind? And I was shocked by what I heard. So one of the stories that stuck to my mind was one young woman said that in her family she watched her 7-year-old niece who loves chocolates. So the family distributed chocolates. She was eating her chocolate and her older brother, 7-year-old, finished his chocolates and wanted more. So she immediately gave her chocolate to her brother. Now there's nothing wrong with that, is it? There's nothing wrong with that. But everyone smiled because they supported the girl giving the boy the chocolates, but there was no expectation of the reverse. So sharing generosity is not an issue in itself, but when it's only one-sided, it becomes problematic. The descriptions that they gave in the 3 words that they used was a woman is caring, sacrificing, and a mother. There's nothing wrong with that, but there wasn't a single person who used happiness or leadership or joy associated in their words with women. But with the men, it was quite different. They used the words power, leadership, adventure, sports, fun. Now, this is not to blame men or to blame women or to blame culture, but it's an unpacking of the inner cultural conditioning that we still have, because this inner conditioning is not just intellectual, right? So gender equality, we've seen it as an intellectual endeavor. And that's important, but we will only get so far if we treat it as an intellectual endeavor. It's actually our notions of what is a good man or a good woman or a good girl or a good boy go very deep, and they become a moral compass. And it's this moral inner compass that determines our everyday behavior without our knowing. So I think now I describe myself as a cultural detective. Not as a sociologist or a psychologist, but it really is. If you put your assumptions aside and you listen deeply, you discover a lot of things. So when I saw what was happening at St. Stephen's, I went to another college, and then I said, if this is happening amongst the educated 20-year-olds, when does it start? So I went into schools and asked the same question. So girls and boys as young as 11-year-old. And that's what ended up becoming the book. I ended up interviewing about 600 men, women, children, and ended up with 8,000 pages of notes. And so the challenge was, how do you distill this? Nobody is going to read. Even I couldn't make sense of 8,000 pages of notes. So what is it? What is the commonality across the different behaviors? And what I concluded was the following: that loving parents are still raising girls not to exist. Loving parents unknowingly are raising girls not to exist, to minimize themselves, to take up as little space as possible. So if a girl, and I'll come to the example, so if a girl is not supposed to exist, she doesn't need any power, right? In fact, if she claims power, it goes against the entire cultural domain. So if you're not supposed to be alive, you don't need power, and so power becomes something that is denied automatically, and then if you claim power, it becomes something dangerous. Now, to look at these, to see how this is done, basically we need to ask, why is it that we didn't know this before? And what I conclude is that because the cutting off a girl's sense of self is done very slowly, very gently, bit by bit, so we don't notice it. So because we're all part of the same culture, we dismiss little sayings, little behaviors, everyday behaviors as normal, as the most common word that people use was jane do, just let it go. Mat bolo, kuch nahi bolo, jane do, let it go. Now that's not a problem, letting go is a good thing, but if that's your response constantly, it again negates the self. I organized the book into 7 habits, 7 clusters of behavior, and each habit you'll find very familiar, and again it'll seem very normal. But taken together, they continuously delete a girl's sense of self, and if a girl doesn't have a sense of self, then it's very difficult to empower. Because there may be a body there, but there's really an empty space. And so for empowerment, we have to look at how power is taken away from girls, but it's made a moral virtue. So when powerlessness is made a moral virtue, it's very difficult, despite training, to reclaim power because you feel guilty, you feel bad. And so you have very powerful women, including the head of the IMF, who says, I feel like an imposter. So why is that? Right? You have the education, you have the status, you have the position. It's because the deep training internally is that women do not deserve power, should be afraid of power, and there's something wrong. I don't know about your families, but in my family, we never talk about girls' bodies. It makes people very uncomfortable. So if a girl is not supposed to exist, you have to do away with the body, right? It's physical evidence that she exists. So if you think about cultural practices, a girl, the silence in the family is pretty extreme, even today. Forget sex education in schools or in homes. The only time parents talk to girls about her body is during puberty, and that's only around periods. And periods too become a source of great shame and are considered dirty. The biggest tragedy of this silence is that when a girl gets molested, she keeps quiet. Because if a body doesn't exist, how can bad things happen to the body? And the second tragedy is that little girls as young as 9 and 10-year-olds don't tell their parents, not even their mother, because there's not enough trust. They don't feel they will be believed. They don't want to make trouble. The Government of India statistics show that between 42 to 48% of girls in India are sexually abused before the age of 18. So it's pretty sobering, and this is not a small survey, but large surveys show this. The 2 other things that are common is girls are told to take minimum space. Thoda adjust kar lo. You sit in cars very little, you take great pride in sitting forward and backward and squeezing yourself or hunching your back or wearing clothes that basically disguise the body. When a girl cannot claim her own body, it's like you have no foundation. You don't have a house in which you live. And so it all starts with reclaiming your body. So it's not about how you dress it or whether girls should become sexual beings. It's can a woman claim her body? So in the self-help groups, the fact that women are made to stand up and look at each other straight in the eye with the heads up slowly starts the confidence building process without talking about it. And so it's one of the most powerful things I think that happens in in the self-help groups that I visited in UP. And when women start walk straight, they're told, many women told us that the mothers tell them, walk posturing down. Okay? So, thank you. The second one is, habit I talk about is voice. Voice is one of the most powerful things we have. Even right now, if I can't speak, you won't be able to hear my thoughts and ideas. And yet, woman after woman said she's told in her house is dheere bolo. Kam bolo. Jor se nahi bolo. Speak softly. Don't speak. Chup raho. In fact, the title of the book is Chup. In fact, Chup, it's a Hindi word, but it's now entered the English Oxford Dictionary because it's used, it's such a common word. So if you don't have a voice, you can't have an opinion. If you don't have an opinion, how do you make a decision? What's the basis of choice? Empowerment. Empowerment is all about choice, but if you don't know your preferences, the most common word I heard was kuch bhi, anything, whatever. In English, you hear the word whatever. Or you say, I don't mind, right? Women often say, I don't mind, kuch bhi. You want to go to this restaurant or that? I don't mind. You want to go for a movie? I don't mind. So in a sense, that's a culturally appropriate way of denying desire, but saying that I would like to do this. A woman who speaks loudly is an argumentative woman, is a woman who is dismissed as aggressive by women as well as with men. So reclaiming voice is really, really important, because without a voice, you're really not fully human. The third habit, the cluster of habits we talk about, and each of these habits, if the voice is removed, it cuts off another sense of self. And without a voice, there's no empowerment. So it all links back to empowerment. The third cluster of habit is probably the most dangerous. Pleasing. In North India, it's always thoda compromise kar do, thoda adjust kar do, jane do. It keeps coming up over and over again. In fact, women describe themselves as a blender. They said, I feel the happiest, my purpose in life is blending with the other so I can bring about their happiness. There's nothing wrong with that. But taken to an extreme, and when that's the only purpose, then it's another way of cutting off a girl's sense of self, because when your core existence is, before you're a saint, you're not a saint, right? If your core existence is to care for others, to make others happy, and to smile even when you're in pain, it's very difficult, again, to ask for what you need and to look after your needs as well. And then again, the lack of balance happens. It's because of displeasing that women stay on in bad marriages, not because they know, even when they have a choice. So even in middle and upper class families, when money is not the issue, they stay on in abusive relationships because the training goes so deep that it's their moral value to stay on and still try and please the man. So in many of these cases, when after 8 or 10 years women walk out of abusive marriages, the mothers would keep telling them, try harder, sacrifice more, and then maybe it'll get better. It doesn't. So the opposite of pleasing is not displeasing. Right? So the message is not that you should move from compulsive pleasing to displeasing or being aggressive. The message is to know what you want and be strong and know when to please and when not to please. Because part of pleasing is never saying no. So not being able to say no becomes a dirty word. I was talking to 4-year-olds yesterday in Delhi. and they're actually partially half Icelandic. And they started telling me about their schools. And they said, one of the little girls, Annika, said, the boy pushed me and it really hurt. And I asked her, what did you do? She said, nothing. I kept quiet. I said, why didn't you ask him to stop it? Just say, stop it. And she said, no, that's a bad word. Where did this come from? So it starts very, very early that not only is no a bad word, but saying stop it is a bad word. Where do these little girls, and the parents are very liberal. Parents believe they are raising their daughters just like they are their sons. But the girls are picking up that they can't say stop it. That stop it is a bad word. So all these very subtle messages that girls get is very disempowering. And unless we recognize that most of the early training of girls is fear-based, that this morning we spoke about fear, that we have to recognize that there's a lot of fear in women, because the training to be a good girl is a constant don't do this, don't do that, ye nahi karo, wo nahi karo, yahan nahi jao, wahan nahi jao, don't wear this, don't wear that, sit like this. Then it becomes defined as what not to do rather than what to do. And for this generation of girls, it's even more complicated because this internal conditioning hasn't changed, but they're also being told, you can be anyone, right? Aim for the sky, aim high, you can be anyone. So the conflict is getting even deeper. I won't go into all the other habits, because you can look in the book. It includes confused sexuality, social isolation. Let me just say a word on that. Our society is set up so that, for example, very simply, after marriage, a girl leaves her home and goes to her husband's home. It may be in another city, in another village. What happens? She immediately is cut off from her social support, her solidarity, her own network. The worst husbands are controlling husbands. Because control, so far, and I'll come back to this, power is defined as control and force. And if we don't redefine power and broaden the definition, we're not going to see change. And people say that lots has changed. It's true, lots has changed. But in the study, what I found after talking to hundreds of students, many 7-year-olds, 11-year-olds, girls said, I wish I was a boy. Not a single boy said, I wish I was a girl. And this is actually, I'm not talking about transgender, this is actually true across cultures. Again, it's not just an Indian phenomenon. Social isolation, so when women get isolated, they're also taught not to trust other women. So unless there is women's solidarity, the only time you see big differences is when women come together. Whether it's in the Me Too movement or whether it's in self-help groups. Why? Because the inequality in power is not an issue of one woman. It's a systemic issue. And if we want to bring about change, you'll always see individual escapees, including myself. But that doesn't change life for the rest of the women. Some women are more resilient than others, but if we want the system of power inequality, or women being devalued to change, women have to come together to support one another rather than pull each other down. And pulling each other down is also a learned habit. It's training. It's not in the genes. It's not a genetic defect. Two other things that I talk about in the book. One is the focus on women in terms of duty. In fact, I conclude that power is imbued in men and morality in women. Everything becomes, a woman's behavior becomes a source of honor and dishonor for the family. And it's another way of just controlling and regulating women's behavior. So, what do we need to do differently? I think two things that you already mentioned in your framework. One is we've got to take safety issues very seriously. The second is we've got to understand the cultural context, not only the cultural context, but the behaviors. But I think the most important is understanding power in a different way. So if girls are not meant to exist, they don't need power. And if you focus on the distribution of power between men and women, it becomes an issue of power, and it becomes an issue of cultural systems, not an issue of men versus women. The second implication is that if women are raised in a particular way, there's a complementarity in which men are raised to view themselves on being masculine in a particular way. That needs to change. So I conclude that women's issues are really men's issues. And unless men get involved in a discussion and thinking about what does it mean to be a good man today, and this conversation starts to happen amongst men at all levels, including in the villages, otherwise you'll have cases of violence against women, which we can avoid by addressing, I think to a much greater extent, by also reaching out to the men. Actually, the research on this, on women's empowerment, whether it's in Bangladesh or India or somewhere else, shows that when women start getting empowered, 1/3 of the men support women's empowerment, 1/3 are neutral, and 1/3 are negative. Because when women become powerful, men assume that they will become less powerful. And that's the reason why our definition of power has to change. Change from forcing or willing someone else to do what you want them to do, to changing it to persuasion, negotiation, influence, inspiration, motivation. Because it's not, we assume that power is a zero-sum game, as economists would call them, that it's a limited pie. So if there's a fixed pie or a fixed cake or a one dosa, if you get more, I get less. But what if there are hundreds of dosas and there's no end to dosas? It doesn't matter, right? So I think that's the mind shift that we need to make when we talk about empowerment. The second is that if power is the issue and not men, and we're all part of the same culture, then we all have biases. We all have the same biases. So you cannot grow up, I cannot grow up in Delhi and not internalize biases against women. So I am biased against women until I wake up and really work hard to undo those biases. I worked on women's empowerment for many years, and it was while writing and researching this book that I was forced, and hearing women's stories, that it brought up my own issues, and I had to slow down. And there, online you'll see there's an implicit bias test at the Harvard University website, and I took that, and one of the tests is on gender, and I emerged as quite biased against women. And I was shocked and very disturbed. So I did it again. The score did not change. So I did it one more time. I said, just to make sure. And the numbers didn't change. But 3 years later, after writing the book and going through and doing my own personal work and hearing women's stories, I took the test again, and it had changed. So it is possible to change, and sometimes it's possible to change very quickly. So let me give you one little example. When women score, women often score low in tests, whether it's math or something else in leadership. And there have been studies done where just before the test is given, women are encouraged and said women are equally competent to men, and the difference between men's scores and women's scores disappears. So this notion that I keep hearing repeated over and over again, that it'll take another generation, that it'll take very long, is just not true. It's because we haven't done it properly. We haven't understood that we have these biases inside us, and that each one of us is a cultural creature. So, if we are all biased, then we should stop being judgmental about bias. So in the book I talk about bias as cultural dirt. So if you have an office, if you have this place, every day you clean it as a matter of fact. You don't say, oh, this is so dirty, so you make a judgment about it. You just do it as a very matter of fact. I think that's what we need to do in every organization. Be very matter of fact and assume that every organization or institution, whether it's run by a woman or a man, is gender biased. Because this gender bias is in the air. It's everywhere. And so if we take this very factual, non-judgmental, non-value-laden approach, it's very possible to change. And don't shame people. Instead, encourage people to change. And it's very simple. It starts with everyday, very simple behaviors. So as part of this empowerment process, if we train women to speak up, for example, then one habit, because all these habits are interrelated, the whole system of disempowerment starts to come apart. And I've seen this over and over again. The last thing I want to say is that power itself is not an intellectual concept. The reason women, even after training, including myself, hesitate when we go into positions of power is because power is imbued with morality. And deep down we think we're breaking some rules, that we don't deserve it. So if we understand that power is morality plus culture, then we have a way forward. And if we broaden the definition of power as just forcing your choices on someone else, we have a way forward in coming together, both men and women, both girls and boys, whether we're in an ashram or in the Prime Minister's office. Thank you.